The rejection ceremony was supposed to be simple. Two wolves standing before the pack, words spoken, bond severed, done. But when Nayara opened her mouth to speak the words that would cut the final thread between her and the alpha of the Ashvale pack, the man who had shared her bed and broken her trust and fathered the child now kicking hard against her ribs, nothing came out. Not because she couldn't say them. Because Kale was on his knees. Not in defiance. Not in anger. The most powerful alpha in 3 territories was kneeling in the dirt in front of his entire pack, with tears running openly down a face so wasted by bond sickness that she barely recognized it. His hands were shaking. His wolf, once a force that could make grown men look away, was silent behind his eyes. And he was looking at her like she was the last breath in a drowning man's lungs. "Please," he said. Just that. One word, stripped of rank, stripped of pride, stripped of everything except the naked, desperate truth of a man who had destroyed the only thing that mattered and was only now beginning to understand the full scope of what he had done. Nayara stared down at him, and the thing she felt was so much worse than anger. It was the terrible, relentless pull of a connection that refused to die, wrapped around the memory of walking into that room and finding him with another woman, wrapped around the months of silence and separation and the child growing inside her that he hadn't known about until a week ago. She felt all of it at once, and it was unbearable. The pack was watching. Every single one of them. 300 wolves standing in silence, waiting to see if their Luna would end their alpha or save him. Nayara didn't know the answer. That was the worst part. After everything he'd done, after every lie and every betrayal and every night she'd spent alone pressing her hands against her belly and hating him for not being there, she still didn't know. She opened her mouth again. The words were right there, balanced on the edge of her tongue, sharp enough to sever everything. But this story doesn't start here. It starts 5 months earlier on a Tuesday evening with a door that should have stayed closed. Nayara didn't find out the way she should have. There was no confession, no tearful admission, no guilty conscience dragging the truth into the light. She found out because she walked into the wrong room at the wrong time, and the image burned itself into her mind with the permanence of a brand. Her mate, her husband, the alpha of the Ashvale pack. In their guest chamber with a woman whose scent Nayara had smelled on him for weeks and tried desperately to explain away. Kale's eyes found hers across the room. The shock in them was almost comical. Almost. If anything about this moment had been capable of making her laugh, she might have appreciated the irony. The most powerful alpha in 3 territories, a man who had never once been caught off guard in battle, frozen with his mouth open and nothing to say. The woman beside him, Lisen, daughter of the Duskmere Alpha, looked at Nayara with something worse than guilt. She looked at her with pity. Nayara closed the door quietly. She did not slam it. She did not scream. She walked down the corridor with her spine straight and her hands steady, and she made it all the way to their bedroom before her legs gave out beneath her. She sat on the floor with her back against the door and pressed both hands over her mouth and tried to hold herself together. She failed. 3 years. 3 years of standing beside him at every council meeting. 3 years of building something she thought was unshakable because he had chosen her. Had looked at her across a crowded hall when she was nobody, just a healer's apprentice with no bloodline and no rank, and said, her. She's the one. The memory split open inside her like a wound tearing along old stitches. Her wolf howled, not in anger, in grief. Nayara didn't know how long she sat there. Long enough for the light beneath the door to shift from amber to gray, long enough for footsteps to approach and stop on the other side. Nayara, Kale's voice, low, wrecked. Please open the door. She said nothing. It wasn't what it looked like, he offered, and the words were so pathetically predictable that something inside her went cold, because it was exactly what it looked like. And the fact that he would insult her intelligence with that sentence told her everything she needed to know about how much he respected her. She stood, opened the door. His face was ashen, his dark hair disheveled, his shirt buttoned wrong. He looked like a man standing at the edge of a cliff, and part of her wanted to push him off it. "Move," she said. He stepped aside. She walked past him without touching him, without looking at him, and the space between their bodies felt like a canyon that had opened in the floor of the earth. Behind her, she heard him whisper her name one more time. She kept walking. The Ashvale Pack House was a sprawling stone compound nestled into the base of the Greyvale Mountains. It had been Kale's family seat for 6 generations, and in the 3 years since Nyara had become Luna, she had turned it into something more than a fortress. She had made it a home. The herb gardens along the east wall were hers. The healing wing was hers. The mediation room where she settled disputes between packmates who would have otherwise torn each other apart was hers. She packed none of it. At dawn, while the compound still slept, Nyara moved through the bedroom she had shared with Kale and took only what she had brought with her 3 years ago. A leather satchel, a set of healer's tools passed down from Arena, the woman who had raised her. 2 changes of clothes, a journal she had kept since she was 16. Everything else, the gowns, the jewelry, the Luna's circlet that sat on the dresser catching the first thin light, she left exactly where it was. Kyle was not in the room. She didn't know where he had slept, or if he had slept at all. She didn't care. That was a lie. She cared so much it was eating her alive, and that made her angrier than the betrayal itself. That even now, even after what she had seen, her wolf ached for him, whined at the thought of leaving, clawed at the inside of her ribs like it was trying to drag her back to him. She ignored it. She had gotten very good at ignoring pain. Tavern was waiting for her at the south gate. The beta of the Ashvale pack stood with his arms crossed and his expression carefully neutral, though his eyes gave him away. He looked furious, and the fury was not directed at her. "Does he know you're leaving?" Tavern asked. "No," Nyara replied. "Good." He paused, and something heavy moved behind his expression. "What he did is unforgivable, Nyara. I want you to know that I told him so. To his face. Last night." She hadn't expected that. Tavern had been Kale's best friend since childhood, his most loyal soldier, the one person whose allegiance to the Alpha had never once wavered. "What did he say?" she asked, hating herself for wanting to know. "He didn't say anything. He put his fist through the wall of his office and then sat on the floor and didn't move for 2 hours." Nyara swallowed hard. She couldn't afford to feel sorry for him. Not now. "Where will you go?" Tavern asked. "Back to Arena. She's still in the outer territories. She'll take me in." Tavern nodded slowly. "If you need anything. If anyone comes after you or tries to bring you back against your will, send word. I don't care who gives the order." The implication was clear. Even if Kale himself demanded her return, Tavern would stand between them. She walked through the gate and into the tree line without looking back. The mate connection pulled at her with every step, a physical tug behind her sternum that grew sharper the further she went. By the time she reached the river crossing 2 miles south, she was gritting her teeth against the pain. By the time she crested the first ridge and the compound disappeared from view, tears were streaming down her face. But she kept walking. The outer territories were a 3-day journey on foot. Nyara made it in 2 because she didn't stop, didn't sleep, didn't allow herself to think about anything except the next step. Her wolf was frantic, howling inside her skull. She arrived at Arena's cabin at dusk on the 2nd day. The old healer took one look at her and pulled her inside without a word. "Tell me," Arena said. Nyara told her everything. The weeks of Lysenne's scent lingering where it shouldn't have been. The excuses she had made for him. The door she had opened. the image she couldn't unsee. Orena listened without interrupting. When Nayara finished, the old woman was quiet for a long time. "The connection is still intact," Orena observed. It wasn't a question. Nayara pressed her hand against her chest where the pull lived. "Yes." "That will be a problem. An uncompleted rejection at this distance will start to deteriorate you both physically within weeks. Headaches first, then nausea, then weakness, then worse." "I'll deal with it," Nayara managed. "How?" Orena asked, her gaze sharp. Nayara didn't answer because she didn't have one. The headaches began on day 4, a low, persistent throb behind her eyes that no herb could touch. By the end of the first week, she was nauseous every morning and exhausted by noon. She threw herself into work anyway, cataloging herbs, treating wounds, mixing tinctures, trying not to think about the man whose absence was slowly killing her. On the 9th day, Maret arrived. Nayara's closest friend in the Ashvale pack burst through Orena's door like a storm front, her copper hair wild from running and her expression flushed with relief and outrage. "I've been looking for you for 3 days," Maret gasped. "Tavern wouldn't tell me where you'd gone. I had to track your scent from the south gate, and do you know how hard it is to track someone through 2 river crossings?" Despite everything, Nayara almost smiled. "You shouldn't have come." "Oh, shut up," Maret replied, pulling her into a fierce hug. She pulled back and studied Nayara with sharp eyes. "You look terrible." "The deterioration," Nayara said simply. Maret's expression darkened. "He looks worse, if that helps. He hasn't eaten in days. Tavern has to physically drag him to council meetings, and Lysen is gone. He threw her out the morning after you left, had her escorted to the Duskmere border with orders never to return." Nayara felt nothing at this news. Or rather, she felt everything, but none of it was satisfaction. "There's something else," Maret continued carefully. "Something you need to know before he finds you, and he will find you, Nayara. It's only a matter of time." Nayara's stomach dropped. "What is it?" Maret took her hands and held them tightly. "You're pregnant." The world stopped. "Your scent changed before you left. I noticed it 3 days before everything happened, but I wasn't sure. Now I am." Maret's grip tightened. "Orena confirmed it while you were sleeping last night." Nayara turned slowly to look at the old healer who stood in the doorway with an expression that confirmed everything. 8 weeks, Orena said quietly, give or take. 8 weeks, which meant this child had been conceived while Kyle was already betraying her with Lysen, while he was already destroying everything they had built. Nayara's hand moved to her belly. Something broke open inside her that was entirely different from heartbreak. Fiercer, more primal. A protectiveness so savage it rewrote every thought in her head. "He can't know," Nayara declared. "He cannot know," she repeated when Orena opened her mouth to protest. "Not yet. Not until I decide what happens next." Outside, the wind shifted, carrying with it the distant howl of a wolf from the direction of the Ashvale territory. Nayara's hand tightened over her belly, and her wolf went still for the first time in 9 days. 3 months passed, and Nayara built a life she hadn't known she needed. Orena's cabin sat at the edge of a village called Bracken Hollow, a collection of maybe 40 homes scattered along a river bend, where the mountains gave way to lowland forest. The wolves here were unaffiliated, lone wolves, outcasts, widows, and those who had simply chosen a quieter existence. They had no alpha, no hierarchy, no pack structure beyond the unspoken agreement to look out for each other. Nayara fit in immediately, because here she was not the Luna. She was simply the new healer with steady hands and an encyclopedic knowledge of herbs. And that was enough. Her pregnancy progressed without complication. The nausea faded by the end of the first trimester. Her energy returned. The headaches from the unresolved connection persisted, A dull, constant ache she managed with willow bark and sheer stubbornness. But the physical deterioration Orenna had warned about seemed to progress slower than expected. The pregnancy is protecting you, Orenna explained one afternoon. The connection recognizes new life. It won't destroy the vessel carrying the alpha's offspring, at least not quickly. Nayara filed this information away and did not think about it. She had become exceptionally skilled at not thinking about things, but her body thought about Kale whether she permitted it or not. She dreamed of him constantly. Not replays of the betrayal, but vivid, visceral dreams where she could feel his presence like a pressure change in a room, his voice saying her name with that specific inflection he used when they were alone, softer, lower, stripped of the authority he wore like armor everywhere else. She woke from these dreams, gasping, her hand pressed to the mark on her neck, the skin hot beneath her fingers. News trickled in from the Ashvale territory through Marit, who visited every 2 weeks with supplies and increasingly alarming reports. "He's falling apart," Maret told her during her third visit, sitting cross-legged on Orenna's floor while Nayara sorted dried valerian root. "The pack is starting to notice." He missed the autumn summit entirely. Tavrin had to attend in his place. "That's his choice," Nayara replied, keeping her voice neutral. "He knows how to end it. He can initiate the rejection himself. He won't. He told Tavrin he'd rather die than sever it." The words landed like a blow. Nayara was quiet for a long time. "That's manipulative," she finally managed. "Maybe," Maret agreed. "Or maybe he means it." "It doesn't change what he did." "No, it doesn't." Winter came early that year. The weeks blurred into months as the first snow fell in late autumn, blanketing Bracken Hollow in white and cutting off the mountain passes for weeks at a time. Nayara's belly grew round beneath her wool sweaters. She felt the baby move for the first time during a blizzard, a tiny flutter beneath her ribs that made her gasp and press both hands to her belly and laugh out loud in the empty cabin. She wanted to tell someone specific, someone whose face she could picture with perfect clarity reacting to this news. She didn't tell him. She added it to the growing list of things she carried alone. The villagers of Bracken Hollow adopted her gradually and then completely. Old Hasek, the carpenter, built a cradle without being asked and left it on Orenna's porch with a note that said, "For the little one." Petra, the woman who ran the village's only tavern, started saving extra portions of stew for Nayara every evening. A teenage wolf named Tiernan appointed himself her personal wood carrier and showed up every morning with an armful of split logs and a shy, gap-toothed grin. Nayara found herself caring about these people with a ferocity that surprised her. She delivered Petra's sister's baby in the dead of winter, kneeling on the floor of the tavern's back room with her sleeves rolled up and her own belly heavy beneath her apron. She treated Hasek's arthritis with a compress of meadowsweet and arnica that made the old man weep with relief. She stitched up Tiernan after a clumsy fall from a tree, and the boy sat perfectly still through 7 sutures because he didn't want to disappoint her. She was building something again, she realized. Something small and quiet and real. Something that belonged entirely to her and had nothing to do with pack politics or alpha bloodlines or the weight of a title she had never asked for. For the first time since she was 16 years old and Orenna had taken her in, she felt like she existed on her own terms. Some nights, after the village had gone dark and the only sound was the river and the wind in the pines, Nayara sat on the porch with her hands on her belly and allowed herself to imagine a life where she never went back. Where she raised this child in Bracken Hollow, surrounded by people who wanted nothing from her except what she freely gave. Where the mark on her neck faded to a scar and the ache in her chest dulled to something she could carry without wincing. It was a beautiful fantasy. It was also a lie, because the connection wouldn't let her go any more than it would let him. But the dreams grew worse as her pregnancy advanced. more vivid, more desperate. She began to feel Kale's emotions bleeding through the connection, grief so thick it coated the inside of her ribs, self-loathing that tasted like copper on the back of her tongue, and beneath it all, a howling, bottomless loneliness that made her own body ache in sympathy. She hated that she could feel him. She hated more that part of her wanted to reach back. In her 7th month, something changed. The dream was different. Instead of Kale's presence, she felt his absence. A void where the pull should have been, like a signal cutting out. She woke in a cold sweat, her hand pressed to her neck, and felt the mark flickering beneath her fingers like a candle in a draught. Arena appeared in the doorway within seconds. She pressed her fingers to the mark and was quiet for a long moment. When she looked up, her expression was grave. "It's not fading," Arena said carefully. "He is." Nayara stared at her. "The deterioration has accelerated on his end, significantly." Arena paused. "Nayara, if what I'm sensing is accurate, he may not survive another 2 months." The room went very still. Nayara's hand moved to her belly, where the baby kicked hard against her palm, and she felt the two truths collide inside her. The man who had destroyed her was dying because he refused to let her go, and the child she was carrying would never know its father. Nayara did not go to him. She told herself this every morning as the mark on her neck throbbed with his fading pulse. She told herself this every evening as she lay in bed and felt their child grow stronger while its father grew weaker. She told herself this when she woke at midnight with his grief pouring through the connection like water through a cracked dam. So vivid she could taste salt on her own tongue. Arena watched her with the careful patience of a woman who had raised a stubborn child and knew better than to argue with a wall. "Pride is not the same as strength," the old healer observed one evening. "Neither is self-destruction," Nayara shot back. Arena said nothing more. She didn't need to. She told herself she would not go to him for exactly 11 days before Tavern appeared at Arena's door. The beta looked like he had aged a decade. His jaw was shadowed with days of unshaved growth, and his eyes carried a weight that made Nayara's insides clench before he said a single word. "How bad?" she asked from the doorway. Tavrin's gaze dropped to her belly. His expression flickered with surprise, then understanding, then something dangerously close to grief. "Worse than you think," he answered. "His wolf has gone silent. Completely. 3 weeks ago, it just stopped responding. He can't shift. Can't heal. A cut on his hand from a broken glass took 4 days to close. 4 days, Nayara. He's an alpha. It should have taken minutes." She held herself very still. "He's not eating, barely sleeping. When he does sleep, he wakes up screaming your name." Tavern's voice cracked on the last word, and he looked away, visibly collecting himself. "The pack elders have called a succession council. If he can't fulfill his duties within 30 days, they'll strip his title. He cheated on me," she managed, and her voice broke on the word in a way she hadn't allowed it to since the night she left. "He took everything I gave him and threw it away for a woman who looked at me with pity. Like she knew. Like she'd known all along." "I know," Tavern replied quietly. "And nothing I say will make that smaller. But I need you to come back. Not for him. Not to forgive him. Just to keep this from killing you both." He glanced at her belly again. "All 3 of you." The baby chose that moment to kick. Hard. Right against Nayara's hand. She closed her eyes. "He doesn't know about the baby," she whispered. "No. If I come back, it will be on my terms. He doesn't touch me. He doesn't enter my rooms without permission. He doesn't get to act like we're anything to each other beyond 2 wolves managing a situation so it doesn't destroy them." Tavern nodded slowly. "I'll make sure of it. And I want answers. Real ones. Not excuses, not deflections. I want to know why, and I want to know for how long. Every detail. He owes me that." "Agreed." Nayara looked back into the cabin where Arena stood watching from the shadows. The old healer gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. 1 week, Nayara said, turning back to Tavrin. I need to arrange things here. Then I'll come. Tavrin exhaled like he had been holding his breath for months. Thank you. Don't thank me. This isn't mercy. This is survival. She spent the next 7 days preparing as though she were going to war, because in a way, she was. Orena helped her pack herbs and tinctures, remedies for the deterioration and supplements for the pregnancy. Marit arrived on the 3rd day, and the two of them spent an evening talking through every possible scenario. What if seeing him makes it worse? Marit asked. What if the pull flares and you can't think straight? Then you pull me out. Physically, if you have to. And if he tries to win you back? Nayara's jaw tightened. He won't. Because winning me back would require him to undo something that can't be undone. On the morning she left, Bracken Hollow turned out to see her off. Petra pressed a wrapped loaf of bread into her hands. Hasek stood by the gate looking like a man trying very hard not to cry. Young Tiernan ran up at the last moment and shoved a clumsily carved wooden wolf into her palm. For the baby, he mumbled, his ears red. Nayara hugged the boy, tucked the carving into her satchel beside her healer's tools, and walked north toward the mountains. The journey took 3 days. By the 2nd day, she could feel Kale's heartbeat through the connection, faint and irregular and wrong. By the 3rd, she could feel his exhaustion like a weight in her own legs. She crested the final ridge as the sun was setting, and the Ashvale compound spread out below her, lit amber by the dying light. The herb gardens along the east wall were overgrown. The training yard was empty. The whole place had a diminished quality, like a body running on its last reserves. Tavern met her at the gate and led her inside without a word. The compound was quiet. Too quiet for a pack this size at this hour. Wolves lingered in doorways and watched her pass with expressions she couldn't read. Some looked relieved. Others looked wary. A few looked angry. And she didn't know if the anger was for her or for the alpha who had driven her away. Tavern stopped at a room in the east wing, far from the alpha's chambers. Your rooms, separate, private. He won't come here unless you invite him. Nayara set her satchel on the bed. She placed her hands on her belly, felt the baby shift, drew a breath that filled her lungs completely for the first time in months. Take me to him, she said. The beta hesitated. When you see him, you should prepare yourself. He doesn't look like the man you left. Tavern led her through corridors that smelled like dust and disuse. When they reached the alpha's office, he knocked once and pushed the door open. The man behind the desk looked up, and Nayara's breath left her body. He was skeletal. The broad shoulders she remembered had narrowed, the muscle wasted, the skin stretched tight over cheekbones that jutted like blades. His dark hair was longer, unkempt, and the hollows beneath his eyes were so deep they looked like bruises. His hands trembled visibly on the desk. But his eyes found hers, and the raw, naked devastation in them was so complete that Nayara had to lock her knees to keep from staggering. He stood, took one step toward her, then stopped himself, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. Nayara, he breathed, and her name in his mouth sounded like a prayer and an apology and a death rattle all at once. Then his gaze dropped to her belly. The world went absolutely silent. Kyle stared at the unmistakable curve beneath her sweater. What little color remained drained from his features. His mouth opened. No sound came out. His knees buckled, and he caught himself on the edge of the desk, gripping it so hard the wood groaned beneath his fingers. Is it? He started, but the words dissolved. Nayara stood in the doorway with her hand on her belly and met his eyes with every ounce of steel she possessed. Yours, she told him, and you don't deserve to know. The silence that followed her words lasted long enough to become its own kind of violence. Kyle stood behind his desk, one hand gripping the edge so hard his knuckles had gone white, and stared at her belly like a man watching the ground open beneath his feet. She should have left the room, should have let the words hang and walked away. But the connection was already doing something terrible. The moment she had stepped into this room, the moment his scent had wrapped around her, the throbbing ache behind her sternum had eased for the first time in months. Her wolf was pressing forward, keening, desperate to close the distance between them. And her body, her traitorous, exhausted body, wanted to let it. She would not let it. His expression was not what she had expected. She had braced herself for possessive alpha joy. Instead, what she saw was horror. Self-directed, bottomless horror. "How long?" he asked, barely audible. "Nearly 8 months," Nayara answered. She watched him do the math. Watched the understanding hit him that while he was betraying her with Lysen, his mate was carrying his child. His expression crumpled, and for a moment she thought he was going to be sick. "I didn't know," he managed. "No, you were busy." The words landed exactly where she intended. He flinched and looked away. "Not tonight." She cut him off before he could start. "Tonight I need to sleep. We'll talk tomorrow. On my terms." She slept that night for the first time in weeks without waking. Deep, dreamless, restorative sleep. The connection hummed steadily, and she hated how good it felt. How right. She found Kale in the small dining room the next morning. He was sitting with a plate of untouched food, his gaze fixed on nothing. "Eat," she ordered, sitting across from him. He picked up the fork mechanically. She watched him like she was monitoring a patient. "You said you wanted answers," he began after several minutes. "I do. It started 2 months before you found out. The Duskmere Alliance negotiations. Lysen's father sent her as his representative. At first, it was politics. She was intelligent, direct, and I respected her contributions." Nayara kept her expression perfectly still. But she also had intelligence about the northern border. Rogue packs gathering, a coordinated attack within 6 months. Information her father would share only through her, only in private. He paused, and the next word came out like it cost him something. "And I was scared, Nayara." Of all the words she had expected, that was not one. Lysen offered an alliance sealed through a secondary mating. A political arrangement. She said it was the only way her father would commit his warriors to our defense. He swallowed. "I refused. 3 times I refused. But the reports kept getting worse, and I was so terrified of losing this pack, of losing you, that I convinced myself I could do it without it meaning anything, that it was strategy, that you would never have to know." "But I did know," Nayara replied, and her voice was ice. "Every wolf in that compound smelled her on you. They just loved me too much to say it, or feared you too much. Either way, the result was the same. I was the last person to learn the truth about my own mate." Kale flinched as though she had struck him. Nayara's nails dug into her palms. "Was there ever a northern threat?" Kale closed his eyes. "After you left, Tavrin investigated independently. When he opened his eyes, they were filled with a fury directed entirely inward. The intelligence was fabricated, all of it. Lysen and her father manufactured the threat. There was never going to be an attack." Nayara gripped the edge of the table. "You're telling me you betrayed our bond because a woman lied to you about a war that didn't exist?" "Yes." "And you didn't come to me. You're Luna, your partner. The person who managed half the operations of this pack." His head dropped. "No." Nayara stood. "That's worse. That's so much worse than what I thought. I thought you wanted her. I could have lived with that eventually. But you didn't even want her. You threw us away for a lie because you didn't trust me enough to tell me the truth." "Where is Lysen's father now?" she demanded. The Duskmere severed contact after I expelled Lee Sen. Tavern believes they're repositioning to take advantage of our weakness. The political implications unfolded with sickening clarity. Kale had been manipulated into destroying his own bond, weakening himself to the point of death, and now the pack that had engineered it was circling. How long until they move? Tavern estimates 6 weeks, maybe less. 6 weeks. She was due in 4. Nayara placed both palms flat on the table and leaned forward. The baby shifted inside her, pressing against her ribs, and she breathed through the discomfort the way she breathed through everything now. Deliberately, ruthlessly. You were manipulated by a woman who knew exactly which fears to exploit, she told him. That doesn't excuse what you did, but it changes what we do next. Kale watched her with an expression she couldn't quite name. Not hope. He wasn't stupid enough for that. Something closer to awe, as though he were seeing her clearly for the first time and realizing that the woman he had betrayed was far more dangerous than the one who had betrayed him. We need to talk to Tavrin, she declared. Now. Kyle stared at her. We? Don't misunderstand me. I haven't forgiven you. I may never forgive you. But I will not let the Duskmere destroy what I built here because you were too weak to protect it. She walked out of the room. Behind her, she heard him push himself to his feet to follow. His steps were slower than they used to be, unsteady, and the sound of it broke something inside her that she immediately buried under 6 inches of rage. The War Council convened that afternoon. Nayara sat in the Luna's chair, directly to the right of the Alphas, which she had vacated months ago. Tavrin had placed her there without asking, and when Kale entered and saw her in it, something crossed his features that she couldn't look at for too long. The council consisted of Tavrine, Elder Rendell, a senior warrior named Josrik, and Orena, who had traveled from Bracken Hollow at Nayara's request. 5 people who now knew everything. How many warriors can we field? Nayara asked. 112 capable fighters, Tavrin reported, down from 140. Morale has been a problem. The Duskmere can field roughly 200. But if they've allied with the rogue packs, as Tavrin's intelligence suggests, we could be facing 300 or more. 3-to-1 odds, Rendell muttered, against a pack led by an alpha who can't shift. The old man's gaze slid to Kale, and there was no kindness in it. Rendell had served 3 alphas in his lifetime. He was not sentimental about the 4th. I can still lead, Kale replied. You can barely stand, Rendell countered. Nayara watched Kale absorb the insult without flinching. 3 months ago, a comment like that would have earned a growl that shook the room. Now he just sat there, diminished, and took it. The alpha's condition is a separate issue, Nayara cut in. Our immediate priority is defense. The meeting lasted 3 hours. Nayara drove it with a precision that surprised even herself. She had spent 3 years learning this pack's strengths and weaknesses, cataloging its resources, understanding its terrain. That knowledge hadn't disappeared just because she had. She assigned scouting rotations to cover the 3 most likely approaches from the north. She restructured the watch schedule so that the strongest fighters rested during daylight and held the walls at night when a wolf attack was most likely. She identified choke points in the mountain passes where a smaller force could hold against superior numbers, narrow defiles where Duskmere's advantage in bodies would mean nothing. She ordered the healing wing restocked and expanded, requisitioned every bolt of clean linen in the compound, and set Orena to training 4 volunteers in battlefield triage. If they come in force, Nayara concluded, we don't meet them in open ground. We funnel them through the eastern pass and hit them from both ridgelines. We use the terrain the way it was meant to be used. Rendell stared at her for a long moment. Then he nodded once, slowly, and something shifted in the room. The Luna had spoken, and the Luna had spoken well. After the council dispersed, Nayara remained at the table reviewing supply manifests. Her back ached. The baby was pressing against her spine in a way that made sitting uncomfortable and standing worse. You should rest, Kale offered from the doorway. I need rest when I decide I need rest. He nodded and turned to leave. Then he stopped. Do you know if it's a boy or a girl? The question was so quiet, so carefully controlled, that it cracked through every wall she had built. Because embedded in those words was everything he was trying not to say, that he had missed it all. Every flutter, every kick, every midnight moment with her hands on her belly, wondering and hoping and being afraid. A boy? She said. She watched his expression break open and then put itself back together in the space of a single breath. Thank you, he whispered, for telling me. He left. Nayara pressed her hand to her ribs and felt the connection ache with something that wasn't pain and wasn't forgiveness and wasn't love, but lived in the same neighborhood as all three. The days that followed established a pattern. Nayara oversaw the pack's preparations with a thoroughness that left no room for doubt about her competence. She treated the sick and injured. She trained 2 younger wolves in advanced herbalism. She ate in the private dining room every morning, and Kale ate across from her, and they spoke only about logistics and the weather and never about anything that mattered. But proximity was healing him. Just breathing the same air, sleeping under the same roof, was pulling him back from the edge. The color returned first, then the weight, then the steadiness in his hands. His wolf, silent for weeks, stirred once during a patrol briefing, and Tavrin nearly wept with relief. On the 8th night after her return, she woke to shouting. Boots in the corridor, voices sharp with alarm. Maret appeared, breathless. Scouts just came in. Duskmere war party, 50 wolves moving through the eastern pass. 50 is not an invasion force, Nayara observed. That's a provocation. Tavrin's mobilizing the garrison, and the Alpha shifted Nayara. For the first time in months, full shift. Nayara grabbed her healer's kit and moved. The eastern wall was chaos. Warriors in various states of shift crowded the ramparts, their breath fogging in the cold night air. And below, in the open ground between the wall and the tree line, a massive black wolf stood motionless, facing the dark forest. Kale. Even diminished, even wasted by months of sickness, his wolf was enormous, the largest in the pack by a full head and shoulder. He stood perfectly still, his ears forward, his eyes locked on the trees where movement flickered between the trunks. A howl rose from the forest, long, mocking, deliberately provocative. Nayara recognized the vocal signature, Lysen. Her blood went cold. The woman wasn't just complicit in the deception. She was leading the war party. Kale's wolf turned its massive head and looked directly at Nayara on the wall. Their eyes locked, and through the connection she felt something that stopped her breath. Not rage, not fear. A question. He was asking her permission. The alpha of the Ashvale pack, a man who had never answered to anyone, was looking at his estranged mate and asking whether he should fight. Nayara placed both hands on the stone wall and leaned forward. Her voice carried across the distance with a clarity that surprised even her. Defend your pack, she said. The black wolf turned toward the forest, lowered its head, and charged into the dark. The skirmish lasted 40 minutes. They drove the Duskmere back past the river. Lysen retreated north with what remained of her force, leaving behind 4 of her wolves who hadn't been fast enough. Nayara spent the next hour in the healing wing, treating the wounded from both sides. 3 Ashvale fighters had taken serious injuries. One, a young female barely past her first shift, had a deep cut across her shoulder that would leave a mark. Nayara cleaned it, packed it with calendula and honey, and held the girl's hand until the shaking stopped. You did well, Nayara told her, and meant it. When she emerged from the healing wing, she found the compound changed. Wolves who had watched her return with suspicion now looked at her differently. The Luna was back, and the Luna had held steady while their wall was under siege. That mattered. Kale emerged last, shifted at the base of the wall, and swayed on his feet before Tavrin caught his arm. Someone threw a cloak over his shoulders. He was breathing hard, his skin slicked with sweat, and blood that she couldn't tell was his or someone else's. "She'll be back," Kale told Tavrin, his voice rough. "This was a test. She wanted to see how fast we could mobilize, how strong I am. She'll report everything to her father." Nyara crossed to him, her healer's instincts overriding every other impulse. She checked his pulse, his pupils, the wound on his forearm that was already closing. His wolf was healing him again, not at full alpha speed but faster than it had been in months. "The shift took everything I had," he admitted, low enough that only she could hear. 10 minutes longer, and I wouldn't have been able to hold it. Then we need to strengthen the connection without... She stopped herself. "Without forgiving me," he finished. Orena mentioned a technique used by mated pairs in conflict, a partial opening. Sustained physical contact, several hours a day. Hands, arms, proximity. Nothing more. "And you're willing to do this?" "I'm willing to do what it takes to keep 300 people alive. Don't confuse strategy with sentiment." They began that night. Nyara sat beside Kale on the bench in the strategy room, their shoulders touching, her hand resting on his forearm. The contact was clinical, deliberate, and it was agony. The moment her skin touched his, warmth flooded through the connection, and with it came his emotions, unfiltered and devastating. The grief, the self-loathing, the aching, desperate love that he was trying so hard to contain because he knew he had no right to it anymore. Her wolf was responding, pressing forward, reaching for him, and the baby was moving, kicking hard against her ribs, responding to its father's proximity with a recognition that was instinctive and completely outside Nyara's control. Neither of them spoke during the first session. They sat in silence for 3 hours while the candles burned low and the compound settled into sleep around them. When Nyara finally pulled her hand away, the absence of contact hit her like plunging into cold water. The second night was harder because she knew what to expect, and dreaded it, and wanted it in equal measure. Kale sat perfectly still beside her, his breathing carefully controlled, his arm rigid beneath her fingers. She could feel him holding himself in check, containing the flood of emotion behind a dam of sheer willpower, and the effort it cost him radiated through the contact like heat from a forge. "You don't have to hold back," she told him quietly on the third night. "I can handle feeling what you feel. What I can't handle is pretending." Something in him cracked, and the connection widened. The love that poured through was staggering. Not the possessive, territorial hunger she might have expected from an alpha. Something rawer. Something that felt like surrender. They repeated the process for 3 consecutive nights, and each night the clinical pretense grew thinner. On the 4th night, the baby kicked so hard during their session that Kale felt it through her arm. He froze. "Was that—" "Yes." His gaze dropped to her belly, and she watched the longing with something that felt dangerously close to tenderness. "Can I?" he started, then stopped. "No, I have no right to ask." She should have agreed. Instead, she heard herself say, "Give me your hand." She placed his palm against the side of her belly. For a moment, nothing happened. Then a kick, solid and unmistakable, landed directly against his hand. Kale made a sound she had never heard from him before. Not a word, not a sob, something in between. His fingers spread wide and his head dropped forward, his forehead nearly touching her belly, his shoulders shaking with silent, wrenching emotion. "I'm sorry," he whispered, "for everything, for all of it." Nyara looked down at him and felt the connection flood with his grief and his love and his desperate, aching regret. And for one terrible, perfect moment she almost forgave him. Almost. Then from outside came the sound of the alarm horn. One blast, then two, then three in rapid succession. Tavrin burst through the door. Duskmere, full war party, 200 wolves confirmed, coming through the northern pass. They'll be at our border by dawn. Nayara's hand went to her belly. The baby kicked once more against her palm, hard and insistent. They were out of time. Dawn came like a blade, thin and cold. Nayara stood on the eastern rampart and watched the tree line darken with movement. They came through the mist in waves, gray shapes materializing between the trunks. 200 wolves, maybe more, spread across the valley floor in a formation that spoke of discipline and preparation. This was not a raid. This was an extinction. Kale stood at the center of the wall, fully shifted, his black wolf flanked by Tavrin and Yosrik. The connection between Nayara and her mate was wide open now, not by choice but by necessity. She could feel everything, the fear he would never admit to, the cold tactical calculation running beneath it, and deeper still, the burning determination of a man who had already decided he would die before he let anything reach her. The Duskmere Alpha, a broad silver wolf with a scarred muzzle, stepped forward from the line. Beside him stood Lysen in her shifted form, a pale tawny wolf whose eyes found Nayara on the wall with a look that carried no pity this time, only hunger. Then they charged. Nayara worked from the wall at first, directing the wounded as they were carried back. But when the Duskmere breached the eastern gate and fighting spilled into the compound, she moved to the healing wing and turned it into a field hospital. The wounded came in a steady, terrible stream. She set bones, packed wounds, stopped bleeding, and sent those who could still fight back out. Her hands ached from the work. Her back screamed from the weight of the baby. She ignored it all. Through the connection, she tracked Kale. Every collision, every desperate rally, every moment his wolf flagged and then found its footing again. He was holding, but barely. The shift was draining him faster than proximity could replenish. Marit appeared at her side, blood smeared across her cheek. Lysen broke through the inner perimeter. She's heading for the east wing. For Nayara's rooms, for the cradle Hasek had carved, for the carved wooden wolf from Tiernan on the nightstand. Something ancient and volcanic rose in Nayara. Her wolf, quiet and cooperative for months, docile through the pregnancy, surged forward with a ferocity that whited out her vision. "Watch the wounded," Nayara told Marit, and her voice didn't sound like her own. She found Lysen in the east wing corridor. The tawny wolf stood in the shattered doorway of Nayara's room, and when she saw Nayara approaching, she shifted. Lysen stood in the wreckage, her lips curled into a smile. "There you are, the little healer playing Luna." "Get out of my house," Nayara replied. "Your house?" Lysen laughed. "You're a nobody with no bloodline. You were always temporary. You manufactured a war to steal a mate bond. You manipulated an alpha into betraying his Luna so you could weaken him, isolate him, and take his territory. And when that didn't work fast enough, you brought an army." Lysen's smile didn't waver. "Politics. Cruelty," Nayara corrected. Lysen lunged. Nayara didn't run, she didn't shift. Instead, she did something that no one expected. She opened the connection completely, not the partial opening she had maintained for weeks. The full force of it. Every wall down, every barrier dissolved, flooding the link between her and Kale with everything she had been holding back. The love she had tried to bury, the grief she had refused to release, the rage and the tenderness and the fierce, consuming need to protect what was hers. It hit Kale like a lightning strike. Through the connection, Nayara felt him stagger mid-fight, felt the shock of her emotions crashing into him, and then felt something she hadn't felt in months. His wolf roared, not the weakened, diminished thing limping along on borrowed time. The full force of an alpha wolf at the peak of its power, fueled by a mate connection that had finally, violently, completely opened. The sound shook the walls. It stopped every wolf in the compound mid-stride. Lysen froze, her hand inches from Nyara's throat. She knew that sound. Every wolf in 3 territories knew that sound. Kale hit the corridor like a black storm. He was massive, larger than Nyara had ever seen him, his wolf swollen with the power of a fully opened mate connection. He placed himself between Nyara and Lysen, and the growl that rolled from his chest was so low and so deep that Nyara felt it in her teeth. Lysen shifted and ran. She made it 3 strides. Nyara turned away. She pressed her back against the wall, her hands on her belly, and breathed. Through the connection, she felt the Duskmere wolves break and scatter. Felt the Silver Wolf retreat, dragging his forces north. Felt Tavreen and the Ashvale warriors pursuing. And she felt Kale shift back to human form and drop to his knees. She turned around. He was on the floor, breathing hard, battered and exhausted. He looked up at her with eyes that were wild and wet and utterly stripped of everything except one single truth. I felt you, he managed. All of it. Everything you've been holding back. Nyara's eyes filled with tears. I know. You still love me, he whispered, and it came out like a man who had been drowning and had just broken the surface. I never stopped, Nyara answered, and the admission cost her everything. That's what makes this so hard. You broke something that should have been unbreakable, and I love you anyway, and I hate you for making me love you through this. He reached for her hand and held it with trembling fingers, his head bowed, his forehead pressed against her knuckles. Tell me what to do. Tell me how to earn it back. Anything. For the rest of my life. You don't earn it back. You can't undo what you did. What you can do is be different. Not for a week. Not for a month. Every single day. You can be the man who never lies to me again. The man who trusts me with the hard things. The father this child deserves. She paused. You can start right now. Kale lifted his head. How? Hold your son, Nyara said. And then her water broke. The boy came into the world screaming. He had his father's dark hair and his mother's stubborn jaw, and a set of lungs that rattled the windows of the healing wing. Orenna placed him on Nyara's chest, and the sound he made when he settled against her skin was the smallest, softest sigh she had ever heard. Kale stood beside the bed, his hand wrapped around Nyara's, his features a wreck of exhaustion and terror and overwhelming joy. When Orenna placed the baby in his arms, the alpha of the Ashvale pack held his son like he was made of glass and wept without a sound. They named him Soren, for no reason other than it felt right the moment Nyara said it aloud. Healing was not a line. It was not a single moment where Nyara decided to forgive, and everything became whole again. It was slow and messy, and some days it felt impossible. There were nights she woke from dreams of that door swinging open and couldn't look at Kale without feeling sick. There were mornings when the anger returned so sharply she had to leave the room. But Kale did what she had asked. Every single day. He told her the truth, even when it was ugly. He brought her into every decision. He held Soren at 3 in the morning when the boy wouldn't stop crying and Nyara was too exhausted to stand. He rebuilt trust the way she had rebuilt the healing wing. Brick by brick, in the slowest, most painstaking construction project of his life. And Nyara let him. Not because the betrayal had shrunk. It hadn't. She carried it the way she carried everything, with open eyes and steady hands and the understanding that love was not the absence of damage, but the decision to build in spite of it. On a morning 6 months after Soren's birth, Nyara woke to find Kale already awake beside her. He was watching the baby sleep in the cradle between them, one hand resting gently on the boy's chest, feeling it rise and fall. He looked at her, and she saw in his features not the guilt or the grief or the desperate hunger to be forgiven. She saw quiet, steady, earned, hard-won quiet. Good morning, he said softly. Nayara reached across the space between them and laced her fingers through his. Good morning, she said back. Outside, the Greyvale Mountains caught the first light, and the Ashvale compound stirred to life beneath a sky that was impossibly, stubbornly blue. Thank you so much for listening. I'll see you very soon for the next.